The Saturday night air in Seoul was crisp, but the rooftop of the Jeon Enterprises luxury penthouse was burning with the heat of success. This wasn't just any party, it was the victory lap for the world's #1 company. The infinity pool reflected the shimmering city lights, and the water looked like liquid diamonds under the expensive spotlights. Jungkook arrived looking like a king who had conquered the world but lost his soul. He wore a tailored midnight black suit that fit his physique perfectly, projecting a bossy and untouchable aura. He stood near the bar, swirling a glass of amber liquid, his eyes scanning the room with a sharp, predatory focus. "You look like you're at a funeral, not a celebration," Jimin teased, walking up in his relaxed pool party attire. Jungkook didn't blink. "I'm here for the employees, Jimin, not for myself." "Sure," Taehyung chimed in, leaning against the counter. "And I'm sure your eyes aren't glued to the entrance waiting for a certain manager to arrive." Jungkook's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. He was a man possessed by a single thought. Y/N. At that moment, the elevator doors opened. Y/N stepped out, and the room seemed to lose its breath. She was wearing a white, knee-length dress adorned with delicate flower prints. The dress moved with her, making her look innocent, ethereal, and devastatingly beautiful. Minho walked beside her, his hand possessively on her waist. He had picked her up from her apartment and hadn't been able to stop staring at her since. "Y/N, I've told you 3 times already, but you are the most beautiful woman here," Minho whispered into her ear. E/N felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thank you, Minho. Let's just try to have a good time and stay professional." They approached the members to offer their greetings. Jungkook stood like a statue. When YN's eyes met his, her heart skipped. "Congratulations on the award, sir," she said softly. Jungkook gave a curt, cold nod. "Enjoy the party, manager." As the night progressed, the professional facade began to crumble, not for Jungkook, but for Minho. Minho's colleagues from his own department were there, and they were a rowdy, aggressive group. They began ordering round after round of heavy drinks. Minho, wanting to prove his manliness in front of his peers, began to drink recklessly. His laughter became louder, his movements sloppier, and his tone with Y/N became increasingly disrespectful. "Minho, please, you've had too much. Let's go get some food," Y/N pleaded, feeling the eyes of the other employees on them. "Stop nagging me, Y/N, Minho snapped, his voice booming over the music. "I'm celebrating. Go to the washroom or something and let me breathe." Hurt and embarrassed, Y/N excused herself and headed toward the washroom to splash some water on her face. The moment Y/N was out of sight, Minho's colleagues surrounded him, their voices dripping with toxic peer pressure. "Look at her, Minho. She's so perfect in that white dress. She thinks she's better than everyone else." One colleague sneered. "It's a pool party, man. Your girlfriend needs to lighten up." "Why don't you throw her in the water?" another challenged. Minho hesitated, but the alcohol had replaced his common sense with a desperate need for approval. "You think I won't do it? You think I don't have the courage?" Minho barked, his face red. E/N emerged from the washroom, looking for Minho so she could ask him to take her home. She saw him walking toward her with a strange, glazed look in his eyes and a cruel smirk on his face. Before she could say a word, Minho lunged. He swept her off her feet, lifting her into his arms. "Minho, what are you doing? Put me down right now." E/N screamed, her voice trembling with fear as she realized he was heading for the edge of the pool. "Everyone is watching. Minho, stop. Please don't do this." "Relax, Y/N. It's just a little water." Minho laughed, a sound that felt like a knife to her heart. With a sudden violent heave, he threw her into the center of the pool. The cold water hit her like a physical blow. Y/N struggled to the surface, gasping for air, her hair plastered to her face. But as she stood up in the shallow end, a wave of absolute horror washed over her. Her white dress, once beautiful and modest, was now completely transparent against her skin. The bright party lights shone directly through the wet fabric, vividly revealing her red undergarments to the entire room. The music seemed to die. The crowd gasped, and then a cruel, mocking laughter broke out from Minho and his friends. Minho stood at the edge, pointing his finger at her and doubling over with laughter, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just stripped her of her dignity in front of her colleagues. E/N felt her world shatter. She immediately crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to hide herself, and looked down at the water. Hot, bitter tears began to fall from her eyes, mixing with the pool water. She was shivering, broken, and utterly humiliated by the man she had trusted. From the corner of the room, Jungkook's glass shattered in his hand. The mafia boss had seen enough. The air at the rooftop penthouse, once filled with the rhythmic pulse of music and the careless laughter of the elite, suddenly froze into a haunting silence. The only sound remaining was the soft, rhythmic splashing of the pool water and the jagged, heartbroken sobs of Y/N. She stood in the center of the shallow end, her white flower print dress clinging to her skin like a second layer of grief, completely transparent and exposing her most private vulnerability to the hungry eyes of the crowd. Minho stood at the edge, doubled over in a fit of drunken, hysterical laughter. His colleagues joined in, their sneers and whistles cutting through Y/N more painfully than the cold water ever could. But the laughter was short-lived. Jungkook had been watching from the shadows of the bar, a silent predator observing the collapse of a moral boundary he would not allow to be crossed. When he saw Y/N desperately crossing her arms over her chest, her head bowed in absolute humiliation, something inside him, the dark, lethal part of the mafia boss, snapped. He didn't scream. He didn't yell. The silence that radiated from him was far more terrifying. With a slow, deliberate motion, Jungkook reached down and set his crystal glass of whiskey on the marble table with a sharp clack. The sound was small, but in that tense atmosphere it sounded like a gunshot. He began to walk toward the pool, his charcoal black suit jacket flaring slightly with each purposeful stride, his eyes burning with a murderous, unbridled rage. As he approached the edge of the water, the laughing crowd parted like the Red Sea. The mocking whispers died in throats. They saw the bossy CEO, but they felt the presence of a man who dealt in life and death. Minho, still swaying from the alcohol, reached a hand out toward the water, seemingly ready to pull Y/N out just to continue the joke. "Come on, Y/N, don't be so dramatic. It was just a laugh." Minho started, his voice slurred and arrogant. He never finished the sentence. Jungkook reached the edge of the pool. Without breaking his gaze from YN's trembling form, he reached up and unbuttoned his expensive, tailored suit coat. He didn't care about the thousands of dollars the fabric cost. He didn't care that his leather shoes were now stepping into the water. He walked straight into the pool. The water rose up to his knees, soaking his trousers, but he didn't flinch. He reached Y/N in 3 long strides. She was shaking so violently that she could barely stand. Gently, but with a firm authority that brooked no argument, Jungkook draped his heavy warm coat over her shoulders. He pulled the lapels shut over her chest, shielding her completely from the prying eyes of the world. For the first time that night, Y/N looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swimming in tears, but in Jungkook's dark gaze, she didn't see judgment or mockery. She saw a shield. Jungkook placed a protective arm around Y/N and guided her out of the water. As they stepped back onto the tile, Minho stumbled forward, his ego bruised by the CEO's intervention. "Sir, wait. It was just a prank. We were just having fun," Minho protested, trying to reach for Y/N's arm. Jungkook's reaction was instantaneous. With a single powerful movement of his free hand, he shoved Minho back. The force was so great that Minho collapsed onto the ground, the alcohol-induced bravado vanishing instantly into a look of sheer terror. Jungkook leaned down, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Enough, Minho. No more. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on the colleagues who had dared to laugh. If anyone, and I mean anyone, speaks a word of what happened here tonight, or looks at her with anything other than respect, they will answer to me personally. Do I make myself clear? The silence was absolute. Nobody dared to breathe. Jungkook turned back to Y/N. She was staring at him in total shock, clutching the oversized coat that smelled of his expensive cologne and power. Without another word to the crowd, he picked her up in a firm, possessive hold and began to walk toward the exit, leaving the world's number, 1-inch celebration, and Minho's dignity shattered in his wake. The penthouse atmosphere remained frozen in a state of collective shock as Jungkook exited the premises, his figure disappearing into the private corridors with Y/N shielded in his arms. The mafia boss had reclaimed his territory, leaving a trail of shattered reputations and a disgraced Minho behind him. His footsteps echoed with a rhythmic, lethal precision against the marble floors, signaling the absolute end of the night's festivities. Jungkook did not head for the public elevators, where the prying eyes of employees and guests might further wound Y/N's dignity. Instead, he maneuvered through the restricted service corridors of the resort, heading toward a private executive suite. Every movement was calculated to ensure she remained hidden from the world. Upon entering the room, he kicked the door shut with a finality that seemed to lock out the cruelty of the past hour. He gently placed Y/N on her feet, though he kept a hand near her elbow as she swayed. She was a ghost of herself, her eyes fixed on the floor, the wet fabric of her white dress still visible beneath the heavy wool of his suit coat. Jungkook walked to a mahogany dresser and pulled out one of his own shirts, a crisp white button-down. He held it out to her, his voice dropping into a low, protective tone. "Go, change. I'm outside waiting," he commanded, the gentleness in his voice a sharp contrast to his usual office persona. E/N took the garment with trembling hands, her fingers momentarily brushing his skin, sending a jolt through her already frayed nerves. She retreated into the bathroom, the soft click of the lock sounding like the only safety she had left. Jungkook leaned his back against the wall adjacent to the door, his jaw set in a hard line. He could hear the sound of the shower running, but beneath the rush of water, he heard the stifled, jagged breaths of a woman who was breaking apart. The realization that she was crying for the man who had betrayed her made his grip on the doorframe tighten until his knuckles turned white. He knew she needed more than just a shirt. She needed a sense of being restored. "Y/N, are you okay?" he called out, his voice acting as a steady anchor in her storm of grief. There was a long silence, punctuated only by the water. Eventually, a small, fragile voice responded. "Yes, sir, I am fine," she lied, the tremor in her words giving her away. Jungkook didn't accept the lie. "Open the door, Y/N, he requested firmly. The door cracked open just enough for her to see him. She was swallowed by his oversized shirt, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. Her hair was a damp mess, and her face was flushed from the cold and the tears. Jungkook handed her a boutique bag. While she had been inside, he had made an urgent call to Taehyung, who had intercepted a high-end dress from the resort's boutique. "This dress has arrived for you. Change into this," he said, his eyes softening as they swept over her face. "I will drop you at your house," he added, making it clear this wasn't an option, but a promise. E/N looked at the bag, a final flicker of her pride surfacing. "I will go on my own, sir," she whispered. Jungkook stepped closer, the air between them suddenly heavy with his command. "I don't want any argument," he stated, his gaze unyielding. Minutes later, they were in the elevator, descending to the private garage. Y/N was now wearing the new dress, a modest, elegant garment that felt like armor against the memories of the pool. The drive through the city was a vacuum of sound. Jungkook drove his black sedan with a focused intensity, his hands steady on the wheel, though his mind was a battlefield. Y/N sat in the passenger seat, her body pressed against the door as if trying to merge with the glass. Y/N keeps looking out of the window out of shame, her reflection in the dark glass showing a woman who couldn't recognize herself anymore. She was paralyzed by the shock of the night, the betrayal of her boyfriend, and the overwhelming, silent protection of her boss. In the quiet of the car, the power dynamic had shifted from professional to something deeply personal and terrifyingly intimate. The neon lights of Seoul blurred into long electric streaks against the rain-slicked window of Jungkook's sedan. Inside the car, the atmosphere was thick with a silence that felt heavier than the storm brewing outside. Jungkook's hands were steady on the leather steering wheel, but his mind was a chaotic storm of protective fury and unspoken words. Beside him, Y/N was a fragile shadow of the woman who had walked into the party earlier that evening. The silence stretched for miles, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. Jungkook kept glancing toward the passenger seat. Y/N continued to stare out of the window, her gaze fixed on the passing city lights, as if they could provide an escape from the shame burning in her chest. She was still wearing the elegant replacement dress Jungkook had secured for her, but she felt as though the entire world could still see her through the wet white fabric of her previous humiliation. Finally, unable to bear the weight of her silent suffering any longer, Jungkook spoke. His voice was no longer the sharp blade of a CEO. It was low, vibrating with a rare, raw concern. What happened, Y/N? Are you still thinking about that incident? Jungkook asked, his eyes briefly leaving the road to catch her reflection in the glass. E/N didn't turn away from the window. Her breath hitched, and a single tear traced a path down the glass before being lost in the darkness. The shock of the betrayal was still settling into her bones like ice. I feel terrible, she whispered, her voice so thin it barely carried across the seat. I can't understand how Minho could do something like that to me. In front of everyone, like I was nothing more than a punchline to a joke. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a profound sense of loss. He was supposed to be the person who cared for me. How could he stand there and laugh while I was so exposed? Jungkook's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. The mafia boss within him wanted to go back and ensure Minho never laughed again. But the man sitting next to Y/N knew she didn't need more violence. She needed a different kind of truth. He slowed the car as they entered her neighborhood, his possessive and protective nature bleeding into his words. Some people look good on the outside, but they are hollow and empty on the inside, Jungkook said, his tone dark and certain. They don't know the value of what they have until they've destroyed it. You shouldn't waste your tears on a man who doesn't even have the spine to respect you. He pulled the car to the curb in front of her apartment building and turned off the engine, turning fully toward her in the dim light of the cabin. You deserve to be with people who see you as more than a trophy or a joke, he continued, his gaze intense and unwavering. You deserve so much more than what he gave you tonight. You deserve everything. E/N sat frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. The bossy CEO, who had spent weeks scolding her, was now the only person standing between her and total despair. Thank you, sir, for everything tonight, for the dress, and for saving me, she said softly, her hand reaching for the door handle. Jungkook watched her, a million things he wanted to say trapped behind his teeth. They sat there for a few more moments, exchanging a few more words as the tension between them shifted from professional to something deeply personal. Go inside and get some rest, Y/N. Don't think about the office tomorrow. Just take care of yourself, he added. She nodded and stepped out into the night. Jungkook waited until she was safely inside the lobby before he restarted the engine. He drove back to his home in silence, his heart a battlefield of rage for the man who hurt her, and a growing, undeniable possessiveness for the woman he had just left behind.